Well, that started all a bit more suddenly than I expected. Hello everybody, good evening, and welcome to Glasgow Skeptics in the pub. I will explain exactly what Glasgow Skeptics is in a few short moments. I think that tonight we are going to be hearing a lot about particular numbers, about 45, about 84.6, about 100, about 2015, 2016, maybe 2020. But first of all, I'd like to speak about a different number, which is number 5. Glasgow Skeptics is going to be 5 years old in November. Thank you. We have been running these events for 5 years. We did start off very much with a scientific and basis and looking at the claims of pseudoscience, and have gradually begun to look more to demand evidence for the claims that are made by politicians and folk in the political sphere. And so that is how we have come to tonight. To see the Admiral Bar full, the Overflow full, and I believe that there is a massive contingent of people who have gone along to the Yes Bar to watch the live stream as well. So, as I say, Glasgow Skeptics, we have hosted talks, sticking on politics for a moment, we have held arranged events about the influence of religion in Scottish politics. In 2011, we hosted the Scottish Parliamentary Hustings, which was described by one of the party leaders as the most stimulating debate of the entire campaign. 2014, we hosted the largest open debate on independence to be hosted by a neutral organisation. And that is certainly something I'm very proud of. But we have done things about science as well. We've hosted talks about whether the psychology of pornography, about whether or not CCTV works, still a sort of political theme. And so we do look at these scientific events, and certainly with the folks we've had on the referendum, we will be looking at some of that stuff as well in the future. I will say very briefly, on November 10th, we are hosting Nate Phelps. Nate Phelps, if you don't know, is the son of Fred Phelps, who was the pastor of the Westboro Baptist Church. He's going to be speaking. Nate left the church on his 18th birthday at the stroke of midnight and rejected it all, as you might think any sensible person would. And he is going to be speaking for free. If you've not already liked Glasgow Skeptics Facebook page or joined the mailing list, please do that. Thank you. Moving right along. So I'm going to very quickly introduce today's speakers, starting from left to right. On the very far left, we have Stephen Paton. Stephen was the founder of a weekly indie ref review series on YouTube, which I'm told was very popular. He has been involved with Glasgow Skeptics almost since the beginning, and so it's very strange to finally to have him up on the stage here as well. But very good nonetheless. To his immediate left, from his perspective, is Lesley Riddoch. I hope we're going to be as enthusiastic for everybody. Lesley is a regular columnist for The Scotsman, and she is the author of Blossom, What Scotland Needs to Flourish. To her left, we have David Torrance. David Torrance is a journalist, broadcaster, BBC, STV. Continuing along, be nice. I feel really bad. Hey, to his left we have Alex Massie. Alex Massie is a very well-respected libertarian and columnist for The Spectator, and he will be here, I suppose, representing that. I should have said, if it has escaped your notice, those folk on the right are from what was the Yes, or maybe what will continue to be the Yes movement, and those on the left from the No side. So Alex Massie, everybody. And to my immediate right, I just realised I've never actually asked how to pronounce your name. Duncan Hothersall, is that correct? Excellent. So Duncan is a co-founder, a founding co-chair of the Equality Network, I believe. He's involved with the Fabians, Labour. He is, as he says in his Twitter profile, a devolutionist, a dad and a small business owner. So please welcome Duncan to the stage. Thank you much. And so I think the way that we're going to progress things, I've been in a bit of a tiz since I discovered that 400 people would be attending here. So give me a moment to recall. Initially, what's going to be happening is that each of the speakers will have up to 5 minutes to make an opening statement of some sort. They will then have 20 minutes or so to cross-examine each other. We'll then, am I getting this right? Yeah. We'll then be taking a short break, a very short break. I realise it's to get some drinks and go to the loo, etc. As you do. We'll then, David will be asking, cross-examining. We'll be asking the panellists some questions, and then finally we'll have some opportunity for some audience members to ask some questions. There are some roving mics around the room, and we will be using those. If you're not comfortable in speaking in front of a microphone, then there should be some paper dots around the room, and I will try and distribute that. And if it's passed, there's somebody upstairs will come collect it from you, and if it's passed to the front here, if you can manage that, then I will also ask the questions if you're not comfortable to that. But I think that's everything. So without very much further ado, over to David Torrance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The first part of the programme, which I've just read from my iPhone email, is for each panellist to give their sort of response to what happened last week in 5 minutes. And I'm going to be quite strict with time so that we're on schedule. So let's start with Stephen. Okay. I'll sort of gesticulate wildly when you're getting near the end of your...
All right. So yeah, my name's Stephen. I first became involved in the campaign for independence because new media was a very big part of what was really driving the campaign forward, and my contribution to it was a series of videos I released one a week that kind of summed up the news for that week for things that I felt weren't necessarily getting covered. And that was really how I became involved and met all the other groups that were campaigning as well, such as National Collective, Generation Yes, and everything else. It became a very big part of my life for quite a few months. So needless to say, I was obviously very disappointed with the outcome. But for me, what I find most incredible about the referendum is that even with the full kind of force of the British state and the majority of the media, since we only had one paper kind of backing us, not to mention a lot of corporate interests, we still managed to get 45% of the country to vote yes. And while it certainly was a loss in a very obvious way, I think it's fair to say that in other ways it doesn't feel like a loss, because we had the opportunity to imagine a better country. And despite a majority of votes going to the no side, there's no sign that our campaign is slowing down. It's just changing. So the Yes campaign was not necessarily a campaign for independence, as strange as that may sound. It was a campaign for change in Scotland, because we wanted to get rid of nukes, we wanted fairer policies that didn't target and punish the poor in our society who needed our help. We wanted a real local democracy, and independence was really just the most viable option to make that happen to us. But independence was not really the end of that path. It was the first step to achieving what we all wanted, which was a better country. A no vote is not the end. We've still taken the first step to that destination, but on a different route, and unfortunately with one arm tied behind our back. Meanwhile, the no campaign was, I felt, a fundamentally dishonest campaign at points. I mean, throughout this campaign we were told that we'd be poorer than Pakistan. We were told that the oil would run out, despite massive new findings happening right now. The Huffington Post actually reported after the referendum that a member of the Shadow Cabinet saying, we couldn't have designed a worse fucking campaign. And in a lot of ways, I think that's kind of true. I mean, if we're talking about reconciliation, it's not reconciliation between yes voters and no voters. It's reconciliation between the people who voted and the campaign that kind of shoved fear down their throats for a large part of it. But there was one very clever aspect of the no campaign that a lot of us overlooked, which, due to the grassroots nature of it, I felt that we thrived in new media, which is what I was a part of. So I was a part of the problem in a big way, because we never really took the time to chat doors and speak to some of the older generations and to tell them that the UK government's Department of Work and Pensions had confirmed a while back that pensions were protected in an independent Scotland. So when the majority weren't on Twitter and Facebook, and this lie kept getting perpetuated that pensions were going to just disappear if we all voted yes, no one was there to kind of counter that. And I think that's where the Yes campaign fell down. If you look at a recent poll from Lord Ashcroft, it was essentially the older generations that overwhelmingly voted against independence. I mean, it's the first poll, and the sample size for 16 to 17-year-olds is ridiculously small, so it's pretty much negligible, and over time we'll start to see more coming out, hopefully. But if we do take any conclusions from it, if it was accurate, it's fair to say that over time we're going to have another chance, because so much of the population did vote for yes within certain age brackets. But this is one of the failures of the Yes campaign. We did not reach out enough to older generations, and meanwhile the Better Together campaign kind of knew where to target for maximum impact in terms of like hammering home fear to a degree. But moving forward, I have genuine hope, because since Thursday night, the SNP has signed up over 16,000 new members, which is more members than the Scottish Labour Party currently have. The Green Party have signed up over 3,000 new members. The Scottish Socialist Party have signed up over 2,000. We're not done yet. And two nights ago, in defiance of the violence that we saw coming from loyalists who kind of stormed into George Square after the vote, people came together to hand over food to Glasgow food banks. And that's been a defining characteristic of the movement for me. It's been about compassion. And that doesn't just disappear because we lost one battle. So right now there's a rally against division happening at the top of Buchanan Street, organised by some Yes campaigners. There's a new Twitter hashtag going out called Empower Scotland, all about what we can do to create a better country. We have to keep that momentum up, and we have to encourage everyone, however you voted, to become a part of it. We have to maintain the pressure in Westminster to follow through on the promises they made, that even now are starting to look a little bit shaky, because we dreamed of a better country, and now it's down to us to build it. Thank you.
Congratulations to Stephen for being 30 seconds under his time. That's a first for this kind of event. Duncan?
I'll do my best. When I agreed to do this, after the referendum as a concept seemed quite a tricky thing to grapple with, and it seems for some of our leaders it remains rather a tough concept. But nonetheless, here we are. I'm delighted to be here despite a tiny sense that not everybody in the audience is with me. Just a tiny hint.
You're laughing and then you booed me.
Okay, so I'll give my view and hopefully be listened to. Here's how I see it. We've spent 3 years staring down the barrel of a binary choice and assigning every issue in our lives to one or other of the options. It's been exhausting, and as a way of agreeing what's best for Scotland, it's been totally dysfunctional. It's time now to embrace a bit of participative democracy, to talk through the pros and cons of the issues that actually matter, and to find some shared solutions rather than exchanging what basically were binary ultimatums. So my simple answer to what now is we need to find a unity of purpose to deliver social and economic justice within a devolution settlement which is now unquestionably the settled will of the Scottish people. What that doesn't mean is revenge against parties or individuals who voted differently from us. Harnessing the Yes cause to, quote, wipe out no parties, as we've seen suggested on Twitter, or harnessing the No coalition to target Yes parties, as we've also seen suggested on Twitter, will just embed division. It also doesn't mean boycotts of companies which took views during the debate that you didn't like. It doesn't mean boycotts of or demos against media figures and organisations. The media actually did a good job. They gave platforms to diverse views. They also delivered brutal analysis, particularly directed at the no side. They should be applauded, not condemned. And critically, it does not mean insisting that independence is still the answer. Scots voters said no, and if we are Democrats, we must accept that. And please do not suggest that those who voted no were duped or tricked or conned. please respect the decision that the voters made. They wanted a devolved parliament within a united kingdom.
This is the worst 80-minute I've ever watched.
So, here's what I think we should be fighting for together now. Real democracy, not the false idea that dividing the UK would have solved the problem. The real route to improving democracy is to reverse the trend of centralisation in Scotland, something of which both Labour and the SNP have both been guilty, and devolve real powers to communities. We should recognise that what our current councils do is regional administration, and what we need is community power. Cities, towns and rural communities with democratically elected government with real cash to spend, because cash means power. We should also be fighting for early years and childcare. It should never have been a referendum football. It's too important. The Scottish Parliament has the powers now to make a real difference, and research shows us time and again that investment in early years is by far the best use of public money to improve life chances. And I would say this as well. If it comes down to a budgetary choice between free university tuition and investment in early years, I will fight for early years every time, because politics should be about benefiting the many, not the few. The last thing we should be doing right now, is refighting any aspect of the last 3 years. That debate has been settled. We have a massive opportunity to harness the political energy created by it. Let's seize it together.
David, I'm just going to say a few words. There is one thing which I usually say at the beginning of Glasgow Skeptics. I have it off by heart, but I forgot to say it tonight. So what we are about is about promoting science and understanding, critical thinking and freedom of expression. And I know that, given the reactions to many people in the room, to the BBC, for instance, I know that people are very passionate about freedom of expression, but it is an equal thing, it should be. And so I would ask if you can not heckle and shout and bully speakers on either side. That would be very much appreciated. There will be time for questions after.
Okay, Duncan was also under time. Lesley, let's carry on the trend.
Well, I mean, this was not, to me, this was not a vote like anything I've experienced in my life. And the defeat was not a defeat like anything I've experienced in my life. Because what happened was the establishment won. Yep. Now, that is what is hard to take. It's easy to accept that you make mistakes. It's easy to accept you can't convince everyone. That's fine. The difficulty is that what happened, particularly in the last couple of weeks, but actually throughout the whole thing, was that we witnessed the most extraordinary ganging up. Perhaps it was coincidental. I have my doubts. It looked like what it was, which was the orchestrated representation of vested interests and the political power, the folk who have made Britain what it is today, a divided food bank society. Now that is what's hard to take. And that is part of what's keeping people wanting to find a way to try to face the future together, because that is perhaps the most important battle or campaign that we could ever fight in this country, is against entitlement. And it reeks out of practically every part of the opposition during the last few months. Now that perhaps is why many people are joining the SNP, the Greens and so on, and that's great. As some of you may know, especially since I stopped drinking, I'm not a party person. And I think the other important thing to pay tribute to was the amazing spirit of connectedness that began to develop without anyone holding a clipboard. In the most Scottish of ways. Because as soon as somebody gets to the front and starts organising everybody, do you know, half of Scots peel off. For the very reason that that authoritarian core, which we can't blame on anyone else, which is in our country, has silenced people for generations. And it was not present in the Yes movement. And for that blessing to be in this country and to feel people picking up the tasks or the challenges or the creative opportunities. You know, folk that I didn't know before, that I would trust, I was going to say with my life, but he's our young yet. But it was like that. And, you know, I cannot hear it described as otherwise, because my last few months have been just charmed. And they were charmed because those months were held by people who had so much hope and a will to be able to drop so many preconceptions and all the things that keeps us a wee bit apart. And we did that crazy, crazy thing. We hoped. And then we discovered that we weren't just quite good at hoping, we were actually pretty blooming good at organising as well. So people were able to move into groups naturally. I mean, everybody keeps saying, what about the division? What about the division? If cells didn't divide, none of us would be in the blooming room. So I think that the groups that were very responsible, Radical Independence, National Collective, Women for Independence, Business for Scotland, Commonweal, all those groups, I hope they will keep going. I'm not too bothered in the least about whether they call themselves collectively 45, 45 plus. I've heard 48, Generation 48, because apparently we're the 48th generation to be Scots since we were independent. I don't care particularly about that, because actually I think what people will miss is the connectedness that we've had for this long while. The ability to walk into a Yes shop and know pretty automatically that you can start talking to somebody who will have a nest of some of the same background now as you have, who'll know who this guy is, who'll have references about Greg Moody and his fabulous cartoons, who'll have watched Lady Alba 5,000 million times, right? And who can't get that song out of their heads. So that, to me, is the important thing to bring forward, is the connectedness, because out of that, all else will flow.
Excellent. Again, under time. Finally, Alex Massie.
The problem with the Yes campaign, I thought, was that it promised the earth and by doing so lost a country. It was a campaign that, by its end, a lot of voters thought was selling something that was just simply too good to be true. There is a place for optimism, there's a place for hope, there's even a place for extravagant optimism in politics, but there is a time when that can curdle into delusion, and I think there was elements of that happening by the latter stages of the Yes campaign. It is true that occasionally Nicola Sturgeon, in some ways I think most restrained of the senior SNP leaders who played an active role in the campaign, would admit that independence per se was not an immediate panacea, would not immediately solve all Scotland's problems, but was merely the best means by which those problems could be solved. But the general tone was rather different. It was one of heroic optimism that by rallying the people, all change, all things that we can want, even those things that are actually contradictory, can be achieved, that there are actually no trade-offs in politics. But politics doesn't work like that. And I think that while it's understandable that a lot of Yes voters are still feeling hurt and deeply disappointed and still to come to terms with the fact that Scotland voted no, moving on to the next stage, and I quite agree that much of the energy that has been generated by the Yes campaign will endure and just be channeled into slightly different areas. And that will actually be a good thing for Scottish politics. While I agree with that and so on, the next phase, what comes next, can't come until actually the result has been accepted, until people have come to terms with the result and its implications. And that means actually also not just reflecting the fact that the sovereign will of the Scottish people is to remain a part of the Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but that people didn't vote no just because they were afraid or intimidated or bullied or bribed into voting no. That a lot of people actually have a deep attachment to the United Kingdom and wanted to preserve that. That may be inconvenient for some people to grasp, and it was something I think that the Yes campaign struggled with at certain stages. This division of the people into Team Scotland versus Team Westminster, a framing device that would be rejected by the vast majority of no voters I know or have spoken to. But I mean, I understand the political reasons for for the Yes campaign to behave in those terms, but I think in the end they became counterproductive. They actually turned off as many voters as they attracted. And I think it was a Yes campaign that perhaps particularly, and Stephen mentioned it before, on social media and so on, spent an awful lot of time talking to itself and congratulating itself, and rather less time actually talking to people who disagreed with it, and failed to actually think about why people disagreed with the Yes campaign, and consequently took a rather sneering and arrogant view of its opponents, suggesting that there was something simple-minded or feeble about no voters who were just on a journey, a deferred yes. There could be no sort of honest or conviction no. And so, you know, when Lesley talks about how the establishment won, well, yes, I mean, of course, I can see what you mean by that in terms of, say, you know, the Newtown in Edinburgh, Morningside voting heavily no, but the Scottish Borders and Dumfries and Galloway voted no, Falkirk voted no, Clackmannan voted no, West Lothian voted no, Inverclyde voted no. None of these.
Okay, come on, let him finish. Let him finish.
None of these places can reasonably be considered bastions of the Scottish elite, and so I think when you look at YouGov's election day poll or survey and so on, now there are some issues with it, but still it found that in socioeconomic classes C to D, E, the vote was essentially 50-50. So even if you ascribe, say, a 5% margin of error to those numbers and so on, it is quite clear that significant numbers of lower income Scots and Scots from poorer communities and so on still voted no. Now, it seems to me that insulting them by assuming that they were duped or tricked into casting their ballots the way they did is not the way to build the kind of social movement or the kind of political movement that Yes activists would like to do, which means in turn then reappraising how you view not just the result, but the people who voted, however inconveniently, the other way.
Right. Okay, thank you to everyone for those opening statements. There are about 15-20 minutes in the schedule for me, as it says, to facilitate cross-examination, which I assume means to allow each side to shout at one another. So I suppose we can take a question from each side to the other. I kicked off from the side, so I'll let Duncan go first in asking a question on the other side. Ian, is that right?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
The cross-examination bit. Do I just let them go?
Let them shout at each other.
Go for each other. Okay.
I'm not about to shout at anybody, but lots of people seem to be wanting to shout at us, which I think is a shame. There was some mention, and Alex picked up on it as well, about the idea that the Yes campaign was an anti-establishment campaign. I think of all the sort of constructs that have been made around the Yes campaign, that one is one of the most difficult to swallow. Lesley, how can a campaign which is led by the government be anti-establishment?
Well, this is where I think you're not getting what the larger Yes movement was. It wasn't led by the government. I mean, this is what the
Alex Salmond led the debate.
I'm answering your point here. It's very, very hard for people with a mindset that's been developed in a country like Britain, which has a tremendously top-down way of doing everything. In that top-down world, parliaments are all that matter. In parliaments, parties are all that matter. So what we hear all the time are measurements of politics and of people's energy, always taken in terms of whether it makes parliamentary difference and how it affects parties. Actually, 1% of Scots are members of political parties, albeit that perhaps today it's 1.5%. That's fine. But the vast bulk of people sit out with that. And absolutely, there was no kind of great shining leader posters on the wall of any of the yes shops I was in, and practically everybody that I was connected with were generally women, actually, setting up lots of meetings who'd never been involved in formal politics, and they're puff. Now, it's unfortunate I can't take you on the journey through what happened for me that time, but that's why I say
understand.
this.
Keep it brief.
It's just the Yes Scotland was the official campaign group, and it led constantly on the content of the white paper, which was developed by the Scottish Government. I think it's a bit bizarre to be in denial of that. The white paper was the basis of the Yes Scotland campaign.
We are talking at cross purposes. I'm talking here, and I was careful to do that. I was talking about the wider Yes movement. Now, okay, there's definitely, the white paper was sitting there. That's probably why everyone got galvanised. Here's the thing, though, Duncan. It would have sat at 30%, the Yes support, if probably everyone in this room who's had nothing to do with formal politics didn't come in and make it their own. And it wasn't because of the...
Okay. Stephen, do you want to have a go at the other side?
Yeah, I do feel that's
in a polite way, obviously.
I do feel that statement sometimes, and this was a thing that always seemed to come from the No campaign. It overlooks the contribution of, as Lesley pointed out, everyone in this room. It overlooked this contribution from National Collective and Women for Indy. People who weren't a part of a campaign. I mean, I was out campaigning with the Green Party at one point. The white paper wasn't their vision for independence. They had a different one. Everyone had a different vision of what they thought it could be, and the fact is that when we voted yes, we'd have a general election, and we could have that discussion.
Sorry, I meant to have a...
Oh, to have a
cross-exam.
Okay, well, well, to elaborate on that answer then. But, yeah, okay, to come back then, is like, do you feel that the No
It doesn't have to be
campaign-
on that, but on anything else.
Do you feel the No campaign fought honestly?
What? I would suggest that the No campaign is not likely to be a campaign that is cited as a case study in political science textbooks in a way that would encourage you to emulate the way the No campaign ran its operation.
Delicately put.
It was a shambles in large part from start to finish, partly because it... I think it actually, bizarrely, the No campaign conceded quite a lot of territory to the Yes campaign without a fight.
But was it honest, I think, was Stephen's question.
I'm still liking the shambles, actually.
It was...
You can have an honest shambles, I suppose.
But there's people associated with the No campaign or with the No side of the debate said plenty of deeply stupid and sometimes dishonest things during the campaign. Against that, so of course did people connected with the Yes campaign. But was it deliberately dishonest? No, I don't think so. But it was quite happy. It was quite happy to. I mean, one of the problems with it was that it was quite happy to speak to a relatively small section of the population, and it took a lot of votes for granted and made no attempt whatsoever, really, to persuade people who were open to the idea of independence but not sure of it to come back to no and offer a positive reason for voting no. And I think that was a worse than a wasted opportunity. It was a sort of politically, it was a sort of quasi-political blunder and a crime almost in campaigning terms. It could and should have been very different and very much better. But I mean, it was never going to be a happy clappy campaign, I think.
Okay, Alex, do you want to cross-examine someone?
Well, I suppose I should ask Stephen then that you know, if the Yes, I mean, again, judging on what you were saying, and it refers back to some of the stuff I was saying earlier, and so on, you know, you said we dreamed of a better country and so on. Wouldn't you concede that lots of your opponents also had that dream? And if the Yes campaign, as you said, wasn't a campaign for independence per se, then what comes next for the SNP rather than the wider Yes movement?
Sorry, you asked two questions there. Which one should I start on? The dreams or?
Yeah, well, if you can cover both of them, I mean, yeah.
Okay. Well, what comes next with the SNP? I imagine they'll continue to campaign for independence because that has been one of their, well, kind of founding ideas for a very long time. I don't think that'll go away just because we got a no vote this time. But sorry, can I ask the question again?
Well, okay. I mean, no. It's just you said that we dreamed of a better country, and again, I think that there are people who hear, perhaps less so in this room, Tom, but there are people who hear Yes campaigners and activists saying that, and they take from it that the sense that does that mean that people who voted No don't have hopes for a better country?
Well, this was, I think, was one of the biggest criticisms of the No campaign, that they never actually outlined the positive case for the Union. They never actually outlined what we could really achieve. It wasn't until the end we started talking suddenly about more powers for Scotland, or suddenly talking about federalism and everything else. Like, that took a very long time to come out.
I think Alex's point was more about people voting No rather than the campaign. Do you concede that No voters?
No, I think a lot of No voters had very good reasons for voting No. I think
are you willing to believe they had a positive vision for the UK?
Some of them. I think like one of the consistent arguments that I heard come from a lot of No campaigners was that they were voting No because they wanted to stand in solidarity with people across the UK, and I can understand that as a sentiment, but I don't think it's relevant. I can understand standing in solidarity, but when you look at the percentage of the Yes vote compared to disposable income, you can see that actually some of the poorest areas in society actually voted Yes, and it's almost like this intellectual idea of standing in solidarity ran counter to what we actually voted for. In the end, I can understand why people may be saying that was the reason, that was the positive reason for why they wanted to vote No, to stand with other people in the country, but I think in doing so they actually overlooked a lot of the people that they were supposed to standing with.
Okay, and Lesley, would you like to throw a question over this way?
Well, I'm trying to think forward, because we could sit and talk a lot about the past and whatever, but I wonder if you guys can accept that, for example, when it comes to key institutions in Scotland, like the BBC, we now have a situation where about 45% of people have grave misgivings about the objectivity of the organisation.
Sorry, can you clarify where that number comes from?
45% of the population
I didn't
being...
vote on the BBC.
No, 45% of the population being those folk who voted Yes. I mean, most people within the Yes camp have got grave reservations about the objectivity of the BBC in Scotland. Yes, they do.
Okay, well, you can both do it, Alex.
Well, I mean,
Go on, listen to the answer.
I mean, what took you so long? I've had grave doubts about the BBC's objectivity ever since I think I became any way politically aware and so on. I think anyone who, in England and so on, for instance, will tell you, now I know a lot of people here will disbelieve this and so on, but anyone who supports UKIP will tell you that the BBC is irretrievably biased against them. Anytime Labour is in power, Labour supporters are convinced the BBC is biased against them. Anytime the Conservatives are in power, people are convinced the BBC is biased against them. The BBC is a reactive institution. It doesn't, I'm not quite sure what you're suggesting, Lesley. Are you suggesting that people should boycott paying the licence fee because they I thought that some people here probably doing that.
Well, can I just say that I don't actually, not yet, but because I think there's a problem. I don't know how we get out of this, actually. Because at the moment, it will cause individuals quite a lot of hassle, actually, to boycott or to withhold their licence fee. And in a funny kind of way, I'm damned if we have to do that kind of damage to ourselves in terms of viewing pleasure to sort out the BBC. The problem is, and it's not a question, I quite agree, and please, I have spent the better part of my life within the BBC hearing manager after manager say that if both sides of the political spectrum criticise you, you must be doing all right. Now, that reductive idea of what good broadcasting is has long made me scream silently, and now not so silently. But the difficulty to me is it was a lacklustre performance at a moment of huge national significance.
Is that not a question of quality rather than bias?
Yes, it is. Quality, enthusiasm, bias, yes, in there as well. A reluctance to accept even what we're talking about tonight is politics. That was a key part of it, that not recognising that all of this extra stuff that was happening even was there until it was pretty obvious.
Okay.
All those things.
Okay, Duncan, do you want to come back as well?
I think the idea that we should that the Yes campaign or the follow-on post-Indie Ref Yes campaign is calling for people to not pay the licence fee is pretty stupid. But the point I'd like to pick up on is this statement is regularly made that the Yes campaign is the nice people and the No campaign are the bad people. My experience, online and in the real world, is being told that you cannot vote no and be a decent person. And that sort of leadership has led to, frankly, the sorts of ugly sentiments being expressed in this room. I think calling some of the members of this audience a joyous campaign is simply not credible. Some of the people in this room simply want to shout down people who disagree with them. And I think the Yes campaign needs to...
No, I was just going to say, Duncan, you're not supposed to cross-examine the audience. Could you respond to Lesley's point about the BBC?
It's insulting to sit here and have people shout at me.
Sorry, save it for the questions. Duncan, can you respond to the point about the BBC? And then we'll have a break, much needed, I think.
Sorry, what was the point about the BBC?
The perception in the Yes campaign, or large parts of it, that the BBC is biased and didn't do its job properly. Would you accept that?
I think everybody will see bias, as Alex has said. I actually genuinely, I know I got booed for it when I said it earlier, I genuinely think the media did a reasonable job. They gave a platform, the Scotsman gave a platform to a lot of people, the Herald gave a platform to a lot of people, and you can't stop yourselves shouting, and it's pathetic.
You're pathetic.
Right. Right. On that slightly tense note, I think we should have the 10-minute break slightly earlier, and we'll reconvene at 8:30.
Give each of the panellists one question. Can we settle down, please? Grassroots. So David is going to ask each of the panellists one question, and then I believe that we are going to proceed. Is that the plan? Yeah. And then we're going to proceed to audience questions. If I'm not mistaken, which I hope I'm not, there will be one microphone up the back over there, which the lovely fellows in the booth will be able to help you with, and there will also be one at the post over there, which I'm still looking for someone to...
Yellow
Brian,
cable on the post at the bar.
Cool, thank you very much. So yes, without much further ado, David Torrance, thank you.
Microphone's on. Nope. No. Hello? There. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Okay. This is where I have to be sort of professionally contrarian. So I will start with Stephen. Looking ahead, I've been instructed to look ahead. We're dwelling on the past too much. Looking ahead, you'll probably be aware the First Minister suggested in an interview yesterday that in future a referendum might not be necessary for independence. I was just wondering if you thought that was a sensible thing to say.
I'm actually quite split in that, because on the one hand, it's like, yes, we can just get it. But on the other hand, I don't necessarily think that would be a good thing for a country that's so split in terms of whether or not they want it, to just take it anyway when they have apparently spoken. I mean, I do disagree with the idea that it was a decisive victory in any way, because it wasn't. It was very close.
But a win's a win. Just one vote, surely.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I do think that I think there will be opportunities again for us to readdress it. I don't necessarily say that we'll just have it as the smartest thing, because I think it will incense a lot of people. But I mean, come in a referendum for the European Union, I think if we get pulled out, but if Scotland voted to stay in, that gives us a legitimate reason to have another referendum.
So you think a referendum is a sort of now a fixture of how this will happen in the future?
Well, it's definitely something that's going to be playing on all the parties in Westminster every time they come round to each general election. It'll be how do we not make them ask the question again, which is a good thing. I think politics has changed as a result of this, because there is a degree of making sure that power does now spread out across the United Kingdom, in terms of making sure that we don't want to just leave, but also not annoying the north of England by seemingly giving Scotland too many powers.
But equally, and it picks up on the point Alex made, there was a lot of talk of self-determination, in fact, going back to the 80s, but a majority of Scots, however slim it was, have self-determined in favour of the union. Does that not create a sort of narrative problem for the yes side?
No, not necessarily. I mean, as I was kind of talking about earlier on with the idea of this very quick poll done afterwards, which is the idea it was tended to be the older generations that had voted to keep no, whereas the majority of everyone else had sort of went towards yes. And like I said, it was a very small sample size. But if it was correct, or even fairly representative, it does seem to imply that it's only a matter of time that this is a question that we'll keep having. Not in that way.
So it's just, I suppose it's similar to the United States, where the Republicans only have so many angry white men, and that will diminish over time. So you think there's a real demographic shift which is going to take place there?
I think so. And
do you think it's fair to blame old people?
No. I want to make it clear that I'm not blaming old people in any way whatsoever. That's not the case at all. But I definitely think that, first of all, giving the vote to 16 to 17-year-olds is amazing, because in a large way, people have become involved in politics at an age earlier than most of us have, and for that they've gotten their first taste of quite arguably one of the most important questions that we've asked in this country. That's not going to just disappear overnight. So we are talking about a politically awakened country coming from 16 and up, and if the movement keeps up, as we all hope, and I personally think it does, not the movement necessarily for independence, but the movement for actual progressive change in Scotland, people are going to be coming up in an environment that wants change, and it's only a matter of time before the question comes back around again. Is like, can we do it better as part of the United Kingdom, or can we do it better ourselves?
The final point, do you not think that there is a risk of a never-endum which leads to a degree of distraction from, I think one of the speakers on this side referred to as the real issues, concentration on inequality and healthcare and education and so on? Is there not a danger that if we keep getting sucked down sort of constitutional navel-gazing, that all of that will get neglected?
I'm going to struggle to answer that one, to be fair. There's a danger that we will just ask this question over and over and over again, and we'll never get it, and it will just become this like never-ending, or a never-endum, as we've seen with I think Quebec and other places. But considering so much of the movement, I feel, was based around this idea of creating positive social change, I don't see how that would just fall to the wayside each time the question is brought up again. Because if the question keeps coming around, it's because we haven't seen the change that we need.
Okay. Picking up on that point, Duncan, you mentioned in your opening remarks that the battle for social justice, presumably you would place Labour at the centre of that battle. But again, looking forwards, is Labour really credibly placed to reclaim that mantle when, for example, just today you have a conference announcement about capping child benefit payments?
Okay, two thoughts on that. Firstly, I don't agree with what Ed Balls proposed today. I think it's a pretty stupid idea.
But nevertheless, he is Shadow Chancellor and will be. I don't mean to imply you're not important, but
I appreciate it's being mooted as Labour policy, and I think we need to ensure that it doesn't become Labour policy. However, in terms of the position of Labour, I think it's interesting to note the shift in rhetoric from Wednesday to Friday, when on Wednesday I was still being told by people like Nicola Sturgeon that Labour was the future in Scotland, that in an independent Scotland Labour would triumph and Labour was the answer.
Oh, this was the argument, vote yes to get your party back.
Yeah. And then by Friday, Labour is the Antichrist again. I think we actually have to... So we have to examine how truthful then either of those statements are, because they can't both be right.
But returning to the point, if Ed Miliband becomes Prime Minister, minority, majority, and the next slide, just go with the scenario.
He's ahead in the polls.
They have.
You could always leave.
Ed Balls, has committed to retaining, the Tory spending plans, austerity, and so on. Surely that will significantly hinder any sort of whole-scale assault on inequality or tackling.
Well, I think it's important to look at what the overall plans are, and while we would stay within the spending limits, we are very clear that we would introduce a banker's bonus tax, we would introduce a mansion tax, and we would introduce a jobs guarantee. And a whole range of these measures are intended and would significantly change how austerity is directed from the poorest onto the richest. And I think that is exactly what we should be doing, and I'm pleased that we in Scotland can still argue for that across the United Kingdom, rather than being narrowed.
But again, on that point, is there a wider issue of credibility that Ed Miliband is unelectable as Prime Minister, and also Joanne Lamont, assuming she leads the Scottish Party into the Holyrood election, is perhaps also unelectable?
I don't think either of those things is true. I think Ed Miliband is the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The reason I think that is that the polling that shows Labour 6 points ahead, or varying between 5 and 7 points ahead, takes into account this supposed doubt about him as a person. The polling is...
You say supposed, but the polling is quite clear.
Yeah, but the polling for votes in the election includes Ed as the leader. So the idea that somehow people will go, oh, no, wait, not with him, is not credible. I think people are going to vote Labour because we offer a genuine alternative to Tory austerity measures.
While retaining it.
While retaining spending... No, this is the point.
Okay.
Austerity...
Let him respond.
The austerity measures that the Tories have brought in target the poorest. Now, what Labour has
you'd
set
have
out...
better austerity.
Labour has set out a plan to tax bankers' bonuses and tax mansions and give a jobs guarantee. Now, that is a fundamental difference. It's a fundamental difference between what the Tories are doing and what we would do. So I think spending limits is not the whole story, and it never has been.
Okay. All right. Lesley, I'm trying to think how to frame this in a way that looks forward. In response, I think it was Duncan's question earlier, you sought to sort of separate out the Scottish Government vision, which I'm assuming you have criticisms of, and the wider Yes vision. But looking ahead and assuming a sort of broad-based Yes movement continues, again, it comes down to, I suppose, what is likely to happen in political terms. And sure, there is that pressure, but in future it's more than likely to be the case that either the SNP or Labour, with support from perhaps smaller parties, will form a government and will therefore fashion pretty orthodox taxation policies, pretty orthodox social justice policies. And therefore, how much pressure can really be brought to bear on the political establishment, in which I assume you would include the SNP as well as the other parties?
Well, here's a wee story actually from Sweden. Now, amazingly, perhaps for everybody who thinks that Sweden is the acme of equality in terms of gender equality in life, it wasn't always like that. And in the 1990s, a set of women, about 6 of them, decided to do something about the fact that actually Sweden didn't have very good childcare and didn't have quotas and didn't have many women active in political life. And they called themselves the Support Stockings, which is a pretty good name. It sounds even better in Swedish. And they said they would spend 5 years on it. And what they threatened to do was they threatened to set up a political party if they didn't get what they wanted. Now, it was a tough thing for them personally. Every single one of those 5 women lost their jobs one way or another. Apropos of the establishment I talked about earlier, it doesn't like people rocking the boat. It particularly doesn't like people rocking the boat. But it isn't too bad about having parties rocking the boat, because they can now be bought off, but people is another thing. So the analogy, just to finish it, is this. You can actually get to a stage, I think, where the usefulness of the movement that still will continue is to basically scare the bejesus out of aspects of the party life that we've taken to be our whole political firmament, to be able to start pushing for things that people want to have happen.
But do you think the SNP is going to be comfortable with that? And the SNP presumably would be the main focus.
I'm not actually in life to make life particularly comfortable for any political party that isn't dealing with the things that need to be dealt with. And as you say, as you know, David, I have had my criticisms of the SNP. Where was land reform all this time? It should have happened. It should have happened. Because if it had happened, and where it was, you may know I was very involved with the Island of Egg, I watched people change over the period of 10 to 15 years, as cynical as they come, some of those egg acts, into people who quite openly believed in managing to do things differently. Now, there's huge swathes of Scotland that voted no because they don't have that belief. And I do take the point some of the guys raised there. It is important not to suggest that the whole of the 55% who voted no are somehow evidencing false consciousness. That, if they only sort of woke up and smelt the coffee and were a wee bit smarter on the uptake or whatever, they would have voted differently. That actually underestimates the degree to which a lot of people in this country are living by a dictum of might is right. They're living under that.
But equally... sure, a campaign can be too negative, but equally, a campaign can perhaps be too positive. And sure, promising radical change and preaching hope and positivity is fine, and it may win you an election or win you a referendum. But I just suggest two recent examples: President Obama's first campaign and François Hollande in France. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, and indeed, the evidence suggests, due to wider forces, which we're all well aware of, it's quite unlikely to happen.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, Scots famously are the only people who have managed to turn a double positive, I right, into a negative, right? We are not that easily thrown. I don't think most people, in the end, a survey found 68% of Scots didn't believe the statistics of either side. And that 68 necessarily includes a lot of people who are intending to vote yes. Now, it seems to be the way this game is played, that folk on the top tables, I sit, one becomes Punch, the other automatically becomes Judy. One says that all will be, hell on a handcart, the other begins to play Nirvana. Now, we've watched that, and actually we've been able to pick our way through these extremes and know ourselves what still needs to be done. And we're not stupid people. But to suggest, for example, that we cannot now move on and do some really quite radical land reform within the space of the next year or 2 years is flying in the face of the fact that every party, bar the Tories, now agrees that something has to be done about this shameful situation. What's standing in their way now?
One last point. One last point. If the land reform hasn't happened within the devolved settlement when the powers are there, does it therefore follow that it's more likely under independence?
Well, to me, this is one that's been raised, and it's a fair point. What strikes me in life is that there are the powers to do things, and then there is the political will to use the powers. Now, what we've had sitting as a kind of small aberration in a template of Britishness, which is what our politics has been, is that we haven't had the political will up until now to use the powers we've got. Britishness is all about, well, there's never too much. When it comes to owning land,
Scottishness as well.
When it comes to owning land, for example, well, this is the point. We're in a British political system, and as yet, the Scots have not managed to break out and create a completely different template.
Okay.
My hope is, for example, that we will stop thinking that the way you run countries is top-down, elitist, devil take the hindmost, winner takes all. That's British. That's a British template we need to excise from our system.
All right. And last but not least... Alex, I'm assuming that part of your vision of the Union going forward is one with more powers for the Scottish Parliament.
Okay.
This is a precursor to the main point.
If you want to make that assumption, David, I won't stop you. Yet.
Right. Okay. Well, yes or no?
On that, well, it's going to happen anyway, so of some sort. But on you go then.
Okay. Slightly.
Yes. The answer is yes. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. But it slightly nullifies my clever question. Is there not a sort of philosophical weakness in the case for the Union where a major part of the case, and you can see this being pursued by the three unionist parties at the moment, is to make that union even looser? It seems rather curious, doesn't it, that if your positive case for the Union is actually to weaken that union by giving more powers to different bits.
No, I mean, I think that's the sort of superficially clever question of the sort that actually Alex Salmond specialises in.
That's the first time I've been compared with Alex Salmond.
I think that no, because that takes a sort of, if you like, a Dycean view of there's only one form of union, and that must remain sort of preserved in aspect forever and ever, and so on. Whereas actually, if you look at the United Kingdom's history, and you're a closer student of that really than I am in many ways, you see that it has evolved and changed frequently over the last 300 years, that the arrangements for the governance of Scotland have taken on many different forms, or several different forms over the years, and it seems to me that the union, if the union is to be preserved, and I'm not at all sure that it will be preserved in 50 years' time, say, then it has to change. I mean, it is quite clear that that's the case. And one way to ensure that it would break up quite abruptly would be to fail to recognise that. And so what you're talking about is two different visions of a union and so on. And it seems to me that the idea that the idea of a Westminster government and then a degree of administrative devolution obviously died long ago, and we're still sort of working through some of the consequences of that.
But why must a successful union change? There's another sort of
because otherwise it might cease to be successful. I mean, if it came to an end, I think one would have to say that at that point it had ceased to be successful.
Did the United Kingdom cease to be successful when, say, the Irish Free State was formed in 1922?
Well, I would consider it a blow.
A pretty sizable blow.
Difficult to see that as one of the union's finer moments. Ireland, of course, is not Scotland.
Okay, would you consider another blow 45% of the population saying we want to follow Ireland?
Yes, of course. Of course it is. I mean, the union is by definition weaker this week than it was last week. Because last week it hadn't been put to this sort of test, and it's a test that it has come through clearly but not convincingly. And it seems to me that that the Overton window has been opened another notch. Even unionists have conceded during this campaign that an independent Scotland, while not necessarily desirable, was acceptable. I think unionists would now have to concede that not only is it acceptable, it is also quite a popular idea. And then, which means that the next step, obviously, in Overton's thesis is that the popular idea becomes policy.
But is there not a sense in what's happening at Westminster at the moment, and indeed implicit in those remarks, of sort of rearranging the deck chairs as on the Titanic?
Well, but you see, I would say that
it sort of reeks of terminal decline.
I would say that there's more than one boat, and not all of them hit icebergs. It's possible to rearrange deck chairs on ships that aren't called the Titanic, or indeed, of course, its sister ship, the Britannic, which also sunk.
Not a good order.
Moving away from maritime history. Yes, decline or evolution. I think it's possible to see how a new set of arrangements on these islands represents a decline of one sort of unionism, certainly, but one that respects and appreciates that the type of Britain that we have now, indeed, actually, in some ways, the type of Britishness we have, is obviously not quite the same as that which existed in 1946, say, and that it would be silly to try and assume that is the moment to be preserved forever, and that changing circumstances shouldn't be met by changing policy. I mean, even at the risk of loosening the bonds to the point at which they become
they break.
They break. Yeah. I mean that's obviously a risk for unionists, but so is doing nothing.
Okay.
So,
right. That's enough from me. Even though I was enjoying that immensely. Okay, I'll kick off by reading out one of the many questions that's been submitted, and then I'll throw it open to the floor. Is there going to be a move for crowdfunding to create a Scottish broadcasting channel? I think Stephen should kick off on that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to do a bit of a Jim Murphy thing and say, I'm going to answer your question, but... no, first of all...
Then I'll throw an egg at you.
It's like, I just really quickly, I'm not blaming all the pensioners for what happened. I'm really bad. My introduction to the referendum was very much... I wasn't involved in politics beforehand, so I'm still learning how to choose my words carefully, which is something that David's given me a thrashing on Twitter a couple of times.
I was to say a thrashing.
Over. But yeah, as for the future of broadcasting, so much of the campaign I felt was driven by new media, which was simultaneously amazing, but as discussed earlier on, also a slight problem with it in that it didn't necessarily reach everyone. And I have seen this move to try and crowdfund a Scottish broadcasting or Scottish broadcaster, which is very cool.
You could run it. You could be chairman.
Yeah, I could do that. Give me your money. No, I think it's a really interesting idea, and it definitely falls in line with the way a lot of things are going, which is people kind of raising funds to take power away, I guess, from the establishment in terms of we've already seen a bunch of alternative newscasters pop up throughout the referendum, including Newsnet Scotland, Newsnet, Wings Over Scotland, regardless of how you felt about them. I mean, people were doing...
Dateline Scotland.
Dateline Scotland, yeah.
Very good.
Absolute brilliant news. I mean, that's already been happening. It's already been happening,
Okay.
and I guess a live broadcast version of it is the next logical step.
Alex, is that something you'd tune into?
I watch very little television as it is, so probably not. Well, look, no, I mean, there's nothing wrong with any of this stuff, but there's a massive difference between something that is watched, on YouTube and gets, thousands of hits there and so on, and we think that has done extremely well, and of course, within the confines of that sort of thing, it has done extremely well. There's a massive difference between that and a mass audience, however, and crowdfunding. I mean, you can crowdfund, podcasts, talk radio, talk television, even broadcast over the internet and so on, extremely cheaply, really, these days. But there is a massive difference between producing content and attracting a real mass audience, which is something that media of all sorts, whether it's traditional or new media and so on, is discovering and so on. And the old system is broken, of course, but the idea of a crowd-funded replacement, while alluring and quite fun in some ways, I think is still probably at this stage wishful thinking. But
is there an
there'll be some interesting projects, I'm sure.
Is there a quality issue?
Well, bound to be, but then there is with traditional media too. So I don't just because. I mean, most stuff is rubbish. And doesn't last, and that is true in any sort of area of sort of human endeavour. So I mean, it'd be silly to suppose that crowd-funded television and radio should be any exception to that.
Okay,
But
right.
the best of it will be very good.
Right. Sensible questions, please. And apparently there's a roving mic, but I'm not in charge of that, mercifully. So.
Two roving
It's over
mics.
there.
One at the left at the bar. It's on.
Lady in the front there with the yes, you know who you are. Yeah. I think the microphone is going to
Just
struggle.
put your hand up or he won't find you.
Step in this direction, please.
Oh, thank you. Just one point to start with. Duncan, I think when you were talking about Nicola Sturgeon and what she thought about the Labour Party before independence and after independence, I think pretty much everyone here knows and agrees, and I'm sure you do too, that what she was talking about was the Labour Party in an independent Scotland would be good for Scotland, whereas Labour in Westminster-style politics is not good for Scotland, and that's why the change was so cut down the middle. And my actual question is, Alex talked a lot about that's not how politics is done, and that's not the way politics works. And although I understand that view of politics, I think the big push from the Yes movement was that that's not how we want politics. That's not the elitist kind of... you understand politics and we don't understand politics, but what we want is to have a new kind of politics. And if we were to be independent, then we could have so much more. We could have a rainbow parliament with Commonweal and various other different parties that would maybe speak more for Scotland. Do you, Alex, do you think that is a possibility?
That sounds absolutely terrifying.
Actually,
idea.
I'll come back to you. I'll come back to Alex. But Lesley, do you have some thoughts on that? This is much mooted. That a bit like I suppose 2003 was with the Greens and the Socialists.
Yeah, well, yes, but it's also the case that we can be doing much of that now, and actually we could have been. I mean, the book that I wrote actually was written before the referendum was called, and it was suggesting that there's a heck of a lot we need to do to make Scotland flourish. And actually, in a way, that's what I wanted independence for, was to do that. Now, we can still do that in large measure, and actually the great thing is, because what the template has been created. I sat in the wee small hours with Derek Mackay, the Communities Minister, who's piloting the Community Empowerment Bill, which is a damp squib as it stands. It's not going to really change very much. And he sat at one point and he said, I've actually begun to realise what community power is. Well, glory bloomin' be, you know? Because a lot of politicians and a lot of commentators have always had their doubts. They think there's a big amorphous mass of apathetic people who couldn't run a proverbial in the proverbial, and actually that's been demonstrably untrue.
By the SSP.
So that's where I think we are now, where the government, the Scottish Government, is also looking and thinking, maybe we've kind of underestimated people in Scotland. And actually, that's no bad thing for any political party to be thinking, but I want to keep the heat on that way, because that's what we really need to change, is that mindset in everybody that sits within an awful lot of the salaried positions we pay for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lesley makes a lot of sense there and so on. I mean, one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years, as the referendum campaign quite understandably and naturally has swallowed up, most attention and so on, is the sort of a suggestion that the Scottish Parliament, as it is presently constituted, and with the responsibilities it has right now, is little more than a kind of parish council. That really it's scarcely worth the name of Parliament at all. Now, I agree that it should have more revenue-raising powers, but to say that it's a powerless institution, or to create the impression that it is a powerless institution, is fundamentally misplaced. It is responsible for 65% of public spending in Scotland. Now, that's a figure that's higher than the equivalent figure in any of the German Länder, for instance. Moreover, when you look at policy areas and so on, we could do a lot more to challenge the Scottish establishment here and so on. Particularly, I think the Scottish educational establishment and so on, which continues to fail far too many people. We have entire high schools where nobody passes 5 hires at grades A to C. We have a situation where it is actually less likely that a Scottish child from the poorest 20% of communities of postcodes and so on will attend a leading university than the comparable child in England or Wales. And yet we continue to tell ourselves that there is something universally admirable about our education system. We're very good at kidding ourselves, I think, in this country, and at failing to address failures and failing to even acknowledge that there are failures of this sort, and the sort of educational inequalities within the state sector between the schools in East Renfrewshire and the schools in Inverclyde and Glasgow City and Dundee and most of rural Scotland as well, actually, is quite appalling, and would, in a slightly I think better polity be considered a national disgrace. But we have the power to change that if we want to, now.
Let her come back.
Just very briefly.
I was a teacher. I'm still teach if I want to, and regardless of it, and I do agree that there's not enough going into education and there's changes that we need to make, but we're still leagues above what Michael Gove has done to England.
Okay.
Could I ask, sorry, just if all audience members could please use a microphone, because there are people watching upstairs and also online who will not be able to hear what's going on.
Next question.
Can I just say one teeny thing, and then
Yeah.
I'd really forgo my other comments, because it's just to try and build on the points that are being made. I mean, I again, maybe strangely, agree with something that Alex has said there. But the nation that's doing best in the world at the moment in terms of education is Finland, right? Now, what the Finns say is the key to their success is equality. The kids are coming into school already with so much more than kids could ever come through the door here. You can't finagle that. You can't blame parents. You can't blame teachers. We have got such an unequal society to start off with that, of course, we get unequal outcomes. Now the question is, are we more likely to be able to reverse that? If we agree that that is very possibly at the root cause of educational inequity in this country, and that it actually continues to feed the assumption by those and such as those that folk that come from the best grammar schools and the private schools are the ones that should be funnelled into university. If all of that we agree has got to go, and we could agree that trying to get a more equal society is the answer, are we more likely to do it as an independent country or as part of a UK where we are swamped constantly by a Conservative vote that seems to keep voting for elitist structures?
I would just make the point, and I probably shouldn't intervene, but the white paper is entirely silent on any of that. So
It is. I wasn't talking about an SNP-led government. I said an independent Scotland.
okay, I'm going to resist the temptation. Another. Does anyone have a question for Duncan? Not that I'm picking on him. A nice question. A nice question.
Have a nice question.
Yes.
Okay, this gentleman here. If you wait for the microphone.
Okay, let's look at scenarios. I'm looking forward. What next? Let's assume that the SNP decide they're going to park their idea of another referendum for a few years. And let's assume, it's a bit more an assumption, I think, that the more powers scenario turns out to be crumbs off the table, which I think it will be.
Meaning it will happen or it won't?
It may happen, but it'll be crumbs off the table. I don't think it's going to be Devil Max. Now, the question is about Devil Max. Going into the general election next year, if the SNP, with the assistance of the 45 and the other parties and the non-party people that were behind that campaign, went forward with real Devil Max in their manifesto, full Devil Max, as outlined perhaps in the 2009 paper, the National Conversation, full fiscal autonomy, perhaps with an apportioned or agreed oil and gas revenues as well. In that scenario, do Labour face electoral mutilation?
Can I just clarify?
Yes.
Was that a nice question?
Well, it wasn't overly hostile. So,
seemed quite hopeful.
Yeah. And he didn't attack you personally, so I think that's
okay. We'll take that as a nice question then. I think there's a number of things that we need to look at in that question. One of them, which immediately strikes me about it, is that if Devo Max is full fiscal autonomy, then that fails Mark Carney's test for a currency union. So we have a problem with fiscal exchange. We have a problem if we have full fiscal autonomy under what he's said.
No.
The question of whether the 2015 election is an opportunity for people to put forward another argument for independence, I honestly think...
Say that, Duncan.
I think, well, that's broadly where you were going. For Devo Max.
We accept the result of the referendum and they park it for a few years.
Okay, if you are essentially wanting to continue what appears to me to be an independence campaign...
Or a Devo Max campaign.
I think 2015... Yeah. I mean, essentially, the Scottish people have just said no. And I think we have to listen to it.
You misunderstand me, Duncan. What I'm saying, the scenario is that the SNP agree to park independence for the next few years at least, and they go forward on a full Devo Max package, which would attract, I believe, some of the people who voted no, who were told they would get more powers, and possibly by next March they'll realise that those more powers are simply crumbs off the table and are not going to provide the type of change that Lesley's describing are the real levers for us to do some of the things that you want to do as well. Yeah. In that scenario, with a Scotland alliance or whatever behind that, I think that the Labour Party face electoral mutilation.
I suppose the question is, how would Labour respond to that sort of proposition?
Well, I don't run the Labour Party, but what I would say is that we should be talking about the issues. I mean, I wanted to come back on Lesley's point and say that I agreed with what her aspirations were.
Come on. We've not heard from Duncan so far. Come on,
I agreed with most of her aspirations, and I agreed with her statement that we can do a lot of that now. And I think when we talk about further powers for the Scottish Parliament, we should take a close look at what use we've made of the powers we have. We don't use a lot of the powers, and in fact, many of us will have had conversations on doorsteps. I'm sure a lot of people, from the sound of this room at least, a lot of people have been out on doorsteps recently, and a lot of people in Scotland think that what we should be devolving is powers on education and health. And we already have those powers, and we don't use them effectively. So I think what the campaign should be, and I think what Labour's campaign would be in that scenario that you set out, is that we should use the powers we have to do good, rather than constantly talk about further and further devolution and further breaking of the...
Duncan, Devil Max was what was sold to the people. Devil Max was the phrase used, and is it going to be real Devil Max? That's all I'm saying.
No, it's not, is the answer to that.
I think what has been promised...
And what can you do with 12% of the tax base?
I think what has been promised is a set of... Each of the three key main parties has set out quite early in the campaign what they would propose. Now, all we have now is a timetable on which it might be delivered, and I think that's a healthy thing.
Okay, no, come on. I think we should move on to another question.
I don't see what's wrong with promised powers.
Chap down the front here. Well, again, wait for the microphone. There's people upstairs that need to hear what you're saying.
I don't want a photo take. No, that's all right. I'm not going to say anything too controversial. It's maybe more of like a philosophical conversation, and it's maybe it's to Duncan, and it's to do with the sort of the Labour clause 4 moment, that sort of stuff, and to do with there was a moment for a while where we thought we were getting rid of something created at the arse end of feudalism. I know you call yourself a libertarian. I was wondering where people think, after we've had the financial crisis, after we have the fall of communism, after we've had the end of the Keynesian experiment, and now we've maybe seen the end of the monetarist experiment. What do people think is the next stage for human history? The next stage for human, the next because you have this crisis across Europe. You have this sort of extreme. You have these crises of social democracy. You have sort of the failure of polities around the world. What's the big idea? If Labour's giving up the idea of a sort of social justice, and it's just. Everything's administration, everything's administration.
Sure.
What can we do with this amount of money? What's the big idea for societies around the world that's going to inspire people? If it's not nationalism.
That's a big question, but I'll give Duncan a breather at the moment and throw it Stephen's way.
Oh, thanks. Well, that's a very interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of what we can be is one of the things that kind of come up during this referendum, what we can do differently. And one of the ideas I've personally really liked has been a few things coming from the Commonweal, which has been looking at what's been working around the world and how we can apply that to our particular situation. And I mean, other than kind of looking at systems that work, because I think that's been the problem for a long time, is that we've been actively pursuing systems that don't work and that have been shown not to work. So when we start to find things that do work, it makes sense to ask, how can we implement this here? How can we make a difference here using these ideas? And yeah, I think the Commonweal has a really strong understanding of what we can do just now.
Surely the Commonweal should be fairly attractive to somebody of a Labour bent.
Indeed, I think it's a fine set of aspirations. Unfortunately, we keep having debates between sets of aspirations and slightly more hard-nosed politics, and I think we need to find a way to bridge that gap. Because aspiration and hope is fantastic, but we do need to actually deliver for people. In terms of the next big idea, I don't think that's how the world will work, and I don't think that's how things develop. It's not as simple as that. But I think a critical idea, and it's something that I suspect Lesley and I agree on, is localism and the idea of devolving powers further, devolving them to communities, empowering communities with real hard power, power backed by cash. And I think that's happening in... it's not happening enough across the world, but it's certainly, when you compare Scotland's community democracy to community democracies across Europe, we are horribly underdone. We have a managerial local government, and we have an opportunity, and it exists under devolution. We don't need any further powers to do it. We have an opportunity to devolve powers to communities and to build the sorts of democratic muscle that empowers people to then move on and engage further with democracy at different levels. So I think one big idea is localism.
Okay. Another question? Lady down front here, if you wait for the microphone. There you go. So on to, yeah.
Thank you. Does the panel think that the threat of higher prices affected the vote? And does the panel think the large vote in Aberdeen and Edinburgh for no was due to the threat to jobs?
Lesley?
Yes, actually. And I think in some ways the Yes campaign might have been culpable in this in a wider way, because, the wider Yes movement, probably people are in here motivated today, equality and social justice were the two big watchwords. And actually, when I started off, I was very careful all the time to match that up with a vision of how good use of our renewable energy resources, for example, would start to create a different trajectory to the kind of jobs we might create. As time went on, it became less about that. It seemed to become much, much more focused on these questions of equality and social justice. And I'm sure those are some of the things that brought people out from the estates. We still didn't, I think, manage to create an alternative economic vision. And that might be hard for a movement to do. I do think that's something, it was hard for the SNP to do. They had put that in some of their white paper, and it was hard for them to drive. I think they needed to drive that one harder. I think we all need to drive this harder, because there's nothing wrong with wanting to have jobs and wealth. It's what you do with it, how you distribute it, that are the key factors.